Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Detroit Institute of Arts Thursdays at the Museum program. I'm Christine Mark, the manager of volunteer development. Thank you for joining us today. Just as a reminder, general admission to the DIA is always free for residents of Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties. So if you like what you see today, and I'm sure you will, we encourage you to please come down to the museum and see the pieces in person. Many of these pieces are on view right now. This month, we're celebrating Pride Month, and it will be a part two or a two-part series, I should say, called Art Pride. The works of LGBTQ plus artists are all across the DIA's collection, and we will be covering some of them today. And then also next Thursday, we will have part two. Today, as I said, is part one, and Ray Henney is here with two new Thursdays at the Museum hosts, and that would be Paul Butcher and Dave Galley. As always, I'll be your moderator. I'll be taking questions throughout the program. To ask a question, log into your YouTube account using your Gmail account or by leaving a public comment on the Facebook page. And we'll take a look at those all through the show to answer questions. Kathleen McBroom, who is with us every Thursday, is behind the scenes, and she is making this all possible by running our slide deck. And our producer today is Gavin Lynch, and we thank Gavin very much for taking his Thursday afternoon with our Thursdays at the museum. So please welcome Ray Henney, Paul Butcher, and Dave Galley for the next 60 minutes. And at the end, we'll tell you about part two next Thursday. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the show.
Thanks, Christine. Hey, Paul. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Ray.
Great to be with you. I'm so looking forward to this. As Christine mentioned, in celebration of Pride Month, the DIA is pleased to present this week and next week 2 Thursdays at the Museum virtual tours of selected works of LGBTQ plus artists in the DIA's collection. These artists have been recognized as some of the leaders of modern and contemporary art. All the artists that are included are either self-identified or have been so identified by their partners, family, or official biographers. Today and next week, we will be presenting just a fraction of the works of such artists in the DIA's collection. Paul and Dave will discuss the wonderful works of these artists and the journeys of these artists. We hope that the tour will fairly represent the beauty and the power of the art and the tremendous strength and creativity of these artists and the human spirit. Dave, you want to start us off?
Sure. Thanks, Ray. And hello, everyone. And I'm looking forward to getting started here. Our first object was created in 1854 by Harriet Goodhue Hosmer, and it's the marble bust of the Greek Gorgon Medusa, who, with venomous snakes for her hair, would turn anyone who gazed into her eyes into stone. But Hosmer does a few things differently. Did you notice? Her Medusa is not a hideous portrayal, but one of a sensuous woman with smooth skin and perhaps silk ribbon in her hair. Medusa's hair, made up of snakes, is typically shown as very active and moving about in space, as if to threaten or strike. Here, Hosmer tames the snakes, having them look like locks of hair, providing the viewer with a tender portrayal of a hideous monster. This piece is usually on view in the American Landscape Gallery, but is currently off view as it is traveling. Next slide, please. Hosmer emigrated to Rome, as was common for women and men, as Europe was more tolerant and was there with several other expats and other independent women. Often, she would use her lovers as models. This may have been the case in our sculpture. So, who was she? Well, Hosmer was from a privileged background. Born in 1830, she went to the best schools, including medical school, where she may have even looked at, anatomy and the human figure. And she had connections that allowed her to do such a thing. Her father funded her time in Rome, encouraging her to pursue what she wanted as her choice. Like many artists, Hosmer had dealt with challenges. As a child, she loved to run, swim, and partake of boyish, or at least activities that were considered boyish at the time. Critics were looking for ways to explain her masculine ambition, a way to downplay her as a sculptress and upplay her as an unnatural woman. At one point, Hosmer was accused of hiring men to do the work due to her, quote, fragility and delicacy as a woman working with heavy tools. Now, the thinking at the time was that sculpting was not for women. The marble was too heavy and too hard to work with, and the tools were also too heavy. Women were just simply too frail and delicate. To overcome gender barriers, one needed talent, hard work, and connections, and Hosmer had all three. Even the male artists hired assistants, though. Also at this time, it was common for women to not be allowed to attend art shows, even if their work is being exhibited. But not to be stopped by such things, Hosmer was known to dress as a man to sneak into those art shows. This extraordinary work of art at the DIA is one of the few by this artist who have survived. Most have been lost or destroyed.
Dave, I think I've read that she was one of the most distinguished, if not the most distinguished female sculptor in America during the 19th century, but that her story was lost until about 2009.
Wow. And you know what, Paul, thanks for that. And that unfortunately has been the case for especially women artists. We just recently saw that, right, with the By Her Hand special exhibition, where a lot of these Italian women artists from the 15 to 1800s, their stories were lost due to misattribution or negative comments or just not being, studied and followed up on.
And males wrote history.
And males wrote history. Yeah.
So there's that too.
All right.
Terrific, Dave. It is a beautiful piece. Displayed. I'm looking forward to getting it back in the museum.
Yeah.
Christine, are there any questions?
At this time, we don't have any questions yet.
Okay. Well, we're just making sure you're there.
No, we're already having a lot of fun now.
All right.
Well,
thanks so much. I'm sorry.
Well, I've got everybody here. Before we introduce any more pieces, I'd like to pause and talk about a few people that were impacted the art scene in the late 19th and early 20th century: Gertrude Stein and Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz was born in 1864 and was a trailblazer photographer who vigorously championed photography as a fine art and established its value as modern art. Now, he did that through his own works, through the journal he published, and the shows he held at his very influential galleries in New York City. He studied photography in Europe in the 1890s. He came back to New York City and truly captured the vitality of the streets and the changing city. And he printed those images. But later on, he published a fine art journal called Camera Work. And around 1810, he embraced more direct and straightforward images moving away from the landscape, the impressionistic, the painterly kind of photographs that people were used to. His galleries, and there were three of them. One is called 291, one's called the Intimate Gallery, and the third is called An American Place. He introduced the European avant-garde and promoted a new generation of American painters, all the while advocating photography's place among the other fine arts. He also did one other thing. He married Georgia O'Keeffe. So between the two of them, you're going to see throughout Dave's and my stories today how much influence they played in getting art into the right hands. Gertrude Stein was an American novelist, poet, playwright, and art collector. She was born in Pittsburgh in 1874. She lived her childhood in Oakland, California. In 1903, she moved to Paris and made France her home for the rest of her life. She died there in 1946 at the age of 72. What's important about her is she hosted a Paris salon. And the salons are a regular social gathering for very important people, especially writers and artists, at the house of a woman prominent in high society. What's truly interesting about Gertrude Stein, the leaders of modern art and modern literature would be at her house. Picasso, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Sinclair Lewis, Ezra Pound, Sherwood Anderson, and Henri Matisse. So that was just amazing. You also probably know her because she catapulted to fame by writing a semi-memoir of her Paris years called The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, written in the voice of Alice B. Toklas, who was her life partner. What's also really important about her is from 1903 to 1914, she lived with her brother Leo on the left bank of Paris, where they accumulated a collection that was just unheard of. They had the ability, and I think it was Leo perhaps that had that ability to spot artists before they really had made it. When they broke up housekeeping in 1914, when Leo left, he took 16 Renoirs with him, and he left her all the Picassos, the Matisse, and all the Cézannes. Could you just imagine having that hanging in your living room? To me, it's just amazing. But what these two people really do for me is they're part of that whole 6 degree of separation. They're part of being at the right place at the right time, who you know. These two people really played a big part of the art scene in the teens and 20s and up into the 30s. The next picture we're going to look at usually hangs in the promenade in the second floor between the modern and contemporary galleries. It's by the American artist Marsden Hartley. At first glance, what do you see in this? To me, you see objects outlined in black, a very dark color. There's a barrel and a wooden wheel paddle in the front, in the middle. But when you step back and look at it, all of a sudden it strikes you with remarkable force. Look at the waves, the water coming up and crashing into the logs. But then when you step back even further, all of a sudden you see it's really a landscape. You see a blue sky, you see a forest, you even see kind of the shore. But again, it's not what people were used to. It wasn't pastoral, it wasn't peaceful, it wasn't romantic. His colors aren't soft. The scene's just not calm. You heard Ray say that these are important people. His final grand and simplified style was noted by critics as, and I'm going to read this, consolidation of his best influences and talents for a personal and powerful contribution to the outstanding traditions of American art, romanticism, mysticism, and robust realism. But this fusion he constituted is known as an American expressionism. I just love that. Hartley
Paul, it is extremely expressed. Could you go back just when you stand in front of it, what you've just pointed out, Paul, you can really get the feeling. It's called logjam, and you have this almost like movement and violence in the foreground, and then the piece in the back. To me, it can give different personal meanings. I've had visitors, when I'm touring, give different kinds of impressions,
even
about that.
Even the colors, Ray, just aren't what people were used to, right? It's not a landscape that you'd see Monet do, right? It's pretty chaotic, right? Yeah. But if you look at him, his life was somewhat chaotic at times. He was born in Maine in 1877. His mother died when he was only 8. His father moved the family to Cleveland, but not him. He had to stay behind and work in a shoe factory for a year. He eventually joined the family in Cleveland. He went to art school at the Cleveland Institute of Art. At the age of 22, he moved to New York City. He studied at the New York School of Art under William Merritt Chase, whose work we have in the DIA collection, in the American collection. What's important again, that who you know, in May of 1909, he did a one-person show at the Gallery 291, of course owned by Alfred Stieglitz, and he was exposed to European modernism. 3 years later, he moved to Paris, and who did he meet? Gertrude Stein. And you're going to hear Dave in a few minutes tell another story where another artist ran into Hartley, and then Hartley introduced him then to Stieglitz, Stein, O'Keeffe, and it changed his life as well. Hartley moved to Berlin in 1913. It was truly the kind of the gay capital of the world at that time. Think about the movie Cabaret. It was just kind of a little decadent little city. He enjoyed the city's homosexual subculture. They say he fell in love with a Prussian officer who died in 1914, and I think he suffered a bit from that for the rest of his life. Hartley was not overt about his homosexuality, though, and often he redirected his attention toward other aspects of his work. He found really gay lifestyle elusive and unfulfilled. He returned to Maine in 1937, just as the Europeans were turning towards war, and became the local level painter of Maine. What's interesting, to his friend Stieglitz, he wrote some very kind of sad letters. He described himself as a gay man experiencing pain that, quote, grows stronger instead of less, and it leaves one nothing but the role of spectator in life, watching life goes by. And when you look at this photo of him, he died at age 66, but you kind of do see from the beginning of his life to the end, kind of that sad, melancholy look. Any questions?
Christine?
All right.
Paul, going back to Kathleen, can we look at the piece again, the logjam? When you take a look at this, I really notice all of the black outlines on the logs, and it just really makes the piece stand out. And it reminds me of some later artists who used that almost like a coloring book scheme, and would create all the black outlines and then fill them in with color. And the way he did that, it just makes it so dramatic.
Oh, no.
It is dramatic, and it's lines usually define things and make them static, but here there's so much movement.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like I can feel the water splashing. That's what gets me on this one, is that you see that log jam, but then all of a sudden behind you just see the force of water going up against it.
And the forest.
Yeah.
The forest.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Terrific. We'll go on to the next piece.
All right, thanks, Paul. Yeah, and by the way, the DIA also owns about 8 other pieces by Marston Hartley, and those are all works on paper. So we're pretty fortunate to not just have the one piece like we did with Hosmer, but we've got several pieces. And so this next piece of art is actually in the same hallway as the prior piece, just on the other side of the doorway. And it was done by a leader in what we call the American Modernist movement, and he was also a pioneer in what we call the Precisionist style, and he was a master watercolorist, and his name was Charles Demuth. So what does Precisionist style mean? Well, let's take a look at the piece and we'll try to define it. Right, and this is something that started right after World War I, when people are starting to celebrate the new American landscape of skyscrapers and bridges and factories. And we also see, and I'm going to use the word precise in its definition of precisionism, a very sharply defined geometric forms. And we also see a little bit of influence of some cubism in abstracted ways here. So we see a what? We see a red building, right? And it doesn't look like a house. It kind of looks like a factory. And we see a lot of regular lines up and down. We see rectangular windows. and the like. And then we see some angled lines going up to like the red water tower, and then we see a black water tower there. And we also see some lines moving across the top, perhaps like a I don't know, maybe an electrical system. And then we also get a sense that this could be a landscape, but not a traditional landscape, right? This has a certain flatness to it, right? It doesn't look that three-dimensional, and it doesn't look like any of those mid-1800s landscapes of scenery and nature and animals and all that peaceful look like Paul had mentioned earlier. Here we have these flatness, sharp lines, and angular other angular lines to it. Sorry about that. And then Ray, didn't you notice something in this the other day?
Well, yeah, I've noticed a couple of things. The first thing that's real interesting is it's as though there's a window. I mean, you've got obviously a drawing, right? And then all of a sudden he colors just a segment of the drawing, which I think is really interesting how the colors pop that way. Then there are objects, Dave, that when I look at in the museum, I can't quite figure out. I'm wondering, Kathleen, at the bottom there, those green, yes. Any thoughts about what those might be?
You know, I having worked in factories most of my life, I remember most of our old factories were always right on a either by a train track or a body of water, and they always had kind of a sawtoothed roof that allowed light to come in on the side, but then rain could then still fall down. So I wonder if that's not the factory next door. But I look at the red factory, and it has very much a Detroit kind of feel to it, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that leads us to wonder, perhaps, where was the artist's perspective? Was he on the roof of that building that's like in front and looking upward on an angle? So it's interesting perspective.
And there's another interesting element. You've got on the left side, lower left side, something that looks like a propeller, or I'm not sure what it is.
Right.
But it's really interesting that it's in there, and it's, you know, it's curious as to the whole theme of precisionism.
Exactly. You know, and that's what happens, right? When we look at paintings, and you know, we start to see more and more when we spend some time looking at them. This piece, by the way, was done in 1931. In 1927, he began a series of paintings depicting his hometown in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, these factory buildings. This one was done, like I said, in 31, and the last one of that series was completed in 33. Okay, and I believe we're going to go to the next slide. Raised in a well-off merchant family, Demuth had the financial freedom to pursue his artistic vision without regard for public opinion concerning aesthetics or even sexuality. He started painting when he had a childhood illness, possibly polio or injury, rendered him unable to walk well. He had a limp, and he used a cane all of his life. He would later develop diabetes and was actually one of the first documented folks to receive insulin in the United States. He studied painting at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, where the realist tradition of former faculty member Thomas Eakins prevailed. In 1912, he began a relationship with Robert Locher, who was also from Lancaster, and they would later become life partners. They did spend 2 years in Paris. And while there, like Paul had mentioned, Demuth had met Marsden Hartley and others by walking up to that table of American artists on the cafe and asked if he could join them. Due to his great sense of humor, riddled with double entendres, you know a lot of those folks, the artists there loved him, and they invited him to join their group.
Paul, there's nothing subtle about you.
No.
Right. I didn't say that, right? So through Hartley, he met Alfred Stieglitz, right? There's that name again, and became a member of his group. His first major exhibition was at Stieglitz's New York Gallery. Upon returning to New York after Paris, Demuth and Locher enjoyed the bohemian lifestyle of Greenwich Village, as well as embracing the summer artist colony in Provincetown, Massachusetts, connecting with leftist writers and artists committed to sexual liberation. Unfortunately, at an early age of 51, Charles Demuth dies, leaving most of his work and his paintings to Georgia O'Keeffe. We're hearing her name again, right? Who strategically determined which museums should receive his artwork. And the DIA is fortunate to own 8 of his pieces.
Dave, what I've read about him is that, truly this Precisionist school that he helped start was really the first indigenous modern art movement in the United States. And I'm so tickled that we have 8 of his pieces. But the one that we have up on display, it reminds me of, when you're in school and you get a protractor and a compass, and I didn't know what to do with those all those years, so I would just draw circles and little pinwheels. He used it in art. If you go back, Kathleen, and look at that piece, and you can see how, like, he drew a circle swatch there. So only part of it's in color. To me, it's just an amazing piece of art that. But again, it's like you said, so flat and so crisp, right? Yeah.
Right. It is. It's like an architectural drawing. It really it has that feel to it, and I think that's what he's harking about, which gives you different kinds of personal interpretations of the work.
Right. So, hey, Christine, were there any questions about this piece?
Actually, more of a viewer comment.
Yeah.
It says that the painting looks almost like a sailboat, as does the unusual boat, like a sail on the left of the building. And then the top lines look almost like a ruler, or, when we were young and we had rulers in school.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a ruler.
Absolutely.
Well, look right there, Kathleen, where the smoke's kind of coming up is part of that sail that the person just talked about, right? To the far right, up on the roof.
Yeah.
It comes out of the building and it colors the sky a little, and it does look like a sail. Yeah, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Terrific.
Wow.
Thank you.
The next piece we're going to look at is a photograph, and it's titled Self-Portrait, and was created in about 1927 by the French photographer Claude Cahun. Take a few minutes, if you could, or a second, to look at this, and what do you notice? What's going on here? What really stands out? What's hidden? What's the setting? What I love about this is Claude Cahun, whose original name was Lucy Schwab, was born in France in 1894. She was a true Renaissance person, a photographer, a writer, surrealist, performance artist, who was largely, again, written out of history until about 1986, when her photographs were rediscovered and included in an exhibition of surrealist photography. But she's known for her self-portraits that show her as ambiguously gendered. I think if she were alive today, certainly the pronoun they and theirs would be hers of choice, and I'll try to use those today, but I may not make it. This piece is currently not on view. Photography and other works on paper must rotate due to their sensitivity to light and humidity. So this is one of those examples where it's great to have us doing this remotely, because you get to see this significant piece of art. Cahun was born to an affluent family. Cahun's mother suffered from mental illness, and Cahun was sent to live with a grandmother. She was Jewish on her paternal side. Cahun was exposed to anti-Semitism and was sent away to Surrey, England for 2 years to school for protection. Upon returning to France in 1909, Cahun met Suzanne Mullerby, who eventually changed her name to Marcel Moore. And they would eventually become not only stepsisters when Moore's mother married Cahun's father, they also became lifelong companions and collaborators. It's thought that Cahun's first self-portrait was taken at about 1913, at the age of 19, launching a lifelong obsession with examining gender, with Cahun herself as the subject. The use of mirrors or mirror balls were almost always included in Cahun's work, as in our object, symbolic of reflection, not only theirs, but ours, as a way to explore identity. In 1917, she adopted the pen name Claude Cahun as a gender-neutral name. At the same time, that Suzanne Mulderby took the name Marcel Moore. Again, both Claude and Marcel were considered at that time in the French language to be a little bit more gender-neutral. Cahun would shave her head a lot during the early 1910s and 20s, actively and outwardly rejecting social constraints of gender and sexual identity. The self-portraits, Cahun is sometimes seen as a man, sometimes as a woman, sometimes thoroughly androgynous, and sometimes so heavily made up and costumed that it's impossible to determine their gender. You know, there's a great video that I've watched, and Dave and Christine make fun of me and my going down the rabbit hole on videos, but there's one that was filmed in 2011 showing a retrospective of Cahun's work. And in that, there's some great photographs of Cahun and Moore as working partners in the art. The photographs that we looked at, there'd be the same photograph of Marcel Moore holding the same object, the same lighting. So Cahun would adjust things, get into her costume, Moore would step aside, and Cahun would then take a self-portrait. So they were partners not only in life, but in their art as well, and I love that. In response to the Nazis' rise to power, Cahun and Moore fled Paris and then went permanently in 1938 to Jersey, a British crown island in the English Channel. They had been summering there since 1922. But at this point in time, they had gone back to their original birth names. Their hair had grown out. The only thing they did differently, according to this video that I watched, was they still wore men's pants and they would walk their cat on a leash. So they still stood out in a crowd. What's important is in 1940, the Nazis invaded Jersey. And at that point in time, these two proud out lesbians created a two-woman resistance. They took their art, they took the ability, and they created pamphlets and then would go into towns and strategically drop these into soldiers' backpacks. They put up a banner. Eventually, in 1944, the Germans arrested them, tried them. They were sentenced to death. They were then tortured because the Germans thought that these two proud out lesbians were part of a larger resistance force. No, it was just these two people. They were eventually, the island was liberated in 1945. They were saved, but Cahun never really recovered from her time in prison. She died 9 years later in 1954 at the age of 60. Moore died about 18 years later in 1972. Their work was auctioned off. Again, in this video that I watched, this conservator in Paris said he'd read a book, heard about this person called Claude Cahun, assumed it was a man, but when he read the book, he said, no, I think she's really a woman. So he placed an ad in a newspaper on the island of Jersey. An antique dealer responded, and this conservator was able to go into this antique store, buy back all the boxes that Moore had sold. And he says it was just fascinating, open up shoe boxes, cigar boxes of photographs that these two people had done. So again, it's so funny. In 2022, we think the idea of gender fluidity is something new. I love the fact that these two women were talking about this, writing about this, photographing this 100 years ago.
Paul, I think your observations were really spot on. Kathleen, could we go back to the slide before this one? I'm sorry, the one, there you go. You're pointing out that she often or always used mirrors in her photos is really telling. And I think this is a particularly provocative use of the mirror. So you have the viewer's view of her, right? And then she's contrasting that with how she sees herself in the mirror. And I think that is really a lot about identity, just as you were saying, Paul.
You know, what's also cool about this particular photograph, Ray, is that when you watch the video, this is one where you see Marcel Moore in the same pose, looking into the same mirror sideways. just moments before Claude Cahun then would step in and do the self-portrait.
Interesting.
And so I see that mirror, four different people looking in that mirror, right? Yeah.
Interesting. Well, thanks so much, Paul. That was excellent. Questions, Christine, or should we move on to the next piece?
Question, what's the name of the video? We have a viewer who wants to go looking for it.
Oh, okay. Here we go. You really have to hunt. It's a YouTube video from 2011, and it's from the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris. So it's JEV. Then the second word is DE, and the third word with a capital P is PAUME. It's actually an old indoor tennis court from the 17th century that after World War II became an Impressionist and Post-Impressionist museum, and then eventually now is a photography museum. But it's the Jeu de Paume.
And
it's the video's in French, but with English subtitles. So my lips were tired by the time I finished reading the video.
That's what I was going to say, isn't it? Not France.
Yes.
France. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Thank you.
So Dave, get me out of here. Come on.
Right. And it was only about 12 minutes long, right? 12 or 13 minutes long.
Yes.
Right. I tried to watch it before the show. And, really, Paul, it's extraordinary that this artist was doing these things in my opinion, hidden from us until like recently, right in the 1990s when her work
Dave,
was
it goes back to what you just talked about earlier, and going back to the 1500s in Italy, right, where women were written out of art history. What's particularly interesting about this one is when you watch this video, you understand how important and groundbreaking her work was, and how proud she was, and just how. And the whole idea of Paris, I watched another video in the teens and 20s. You could be different, and you were encouraged to be different. Yeah, great. Mm-hmm. So, Dave, get me out of here.
Sure. So, interestingly, we're going to do another photograph from our fantastic collection at the DIA, and this one's a bit different. Right? This isn't just a singular person in here with some objects. We have this waterfront from roof of the Irving Trust Company building, New York City, in 1938 by Berenice Abbott, and it's a cityscape, right? So, right, we talked about that a little earlier with Charles Demuth trying to capture the new American landscape, and so is Berenice Abbott. And this is what's considered a pre-WPA photograph of New York City, showing this burgeoning transformation into a modern urban center with these huge skyscrapers rather than like low-rise neighborhood buildings. And Abbott's buildings were often photographed, by the way, in such a way to appear menacing. And this is a conscious decision on her part. The view, right? Our view, her view, is unique. Where did she put us? Where are we at looking down on this enormous, high rise here? Where is she at to take this photo? There's no drones going on here. That's the next slide, please. Abbott used a preferred camera, and it was the 8x10 large format camera because of its yet unsurpassed ability to really capture a crisp image. I mean, look at the size of that camera and the height of that tripod. The two together are almost as tall as she is, right? And it weighed several pounds. So imagine her carrying this up to wherever on that building and setting it up to get the right angle and the right shot, for her. Now, like Claude Cahun's piece, unfortunately, despite her enormous effort of heaving this camera up top of a next door building, this piece is currently not on view. So Abbott was born in Springfield, Ohio in 1898. She had the opportunity, as we've heard other artists do, other Americans. In 21, she went to Paris and fell in love with the city the moment she arrived. She was able to secure an apprenticeship with the famed photographer Man Ray. And in 1926, she set up her own studio, shooting mostly celebrity photos of the Jazz Age series in Vanity Fair magazine. This image is part of her career as a documentary photographer, using New York City as her subject when she returned from Paris in 1929. In 35, she began a 5-year endeavor called Changing New York that concentrated on the buildings and the changing cityscape of New York City. The project was funded by the Federal Aid Project, which gave funding to artists as part of FDR's New Deal. She was hopeful that, through her urban planning efforts, aided by her photographs, she hoped that America would be able to wrest control of their cities and bring about a more human-scaled era. Her style of straight photography helped make her important contributions to scientific photography. Many of her images were used in high school physics textbooks. So what do I mean by straight photography? Well, it's a movement in photography that stresses the importance of photographs being unmanipulated in both the subject matter, when you take the picture, as well as the developing process. And, this goes along with, as we talk about in our Women Photographers Talk, that it was women who took on photography and made it into a art form. Men used the camera as a tool, but women found possibility, and we saw that with Claude Cahun, and now we see that here with Berenice Abbott, really making photography into an art form. She was a self-proclaimed lesbian before such a designation even existed or was acceptable. In 35, she also moved to Greenwich Village with art critic Elizabeth McCausland. They lived together for over 30 years until McCausland's death in 1965. Abbott's work really documented and praised the New York landscape. And again, it was just all guided by her belief that a modern day invention, such as the camera, deserved to document the 20th century. And I'm going to leave this piece with a quote from Abbott, She says, "The world doesn't like independent women. Why? I don't know, but I don't care."
Dave, guess what I did yesterday?
You bought a camera.
Watched the video.
I watched an hour video about Bernice Abbott. I'd watched it when I was in my training class back in 2017. It's called Bernice Abbott: A View of the 20th Century, and it's on Amazon. It takes a full hour. This woman, you all, was so fascinating and so important to the world of photography in the 20th century. She lived to be 93. She narrates this whole hour-long documentary. It's just fascinating. It really breaks her life into 3 pieces. The Paris part, certainly the part that we're looking at here, the 50 years she was photographing New York City, but then also this just amazing scientific work that she did and the patents she holds. It was just an amazing thing. And she and McCausland in 1939 did a kind of an on-the-road series where they photographed the Midwest and the southern parts of the United States. And it's just a fascinating thing. It's an hour long. So, I wish I would have had a gin and tonic, but it was fascinating, Dave, just fascinating.
So it sounds like your shipment of bonbons came in, so you can watch the video, and you're waiting on the gin and tonic.
There we go.
But Dave, you ran out of gin.
Yeah,
exactly.
no.
Kathleen,
So
can
sorry.
you go to the photo, please? Dave, I love the fact that you pointed out that these buildings look menacing, because in the foreground there is a traditional architectural religious building that looks like it is going to be eaten up by these modern buildings. I think that it's really an interesting statement on her part. I mean, this angle is really interesting, but if you start looking at the subject that she's contrasting these large buildings with very intelligent, very interesting.
Ray, she talks about that in the video. She also
Is
talks
she?
about how she's so afraid of heights, and she had to get away from that. But she said a lot of times these things she couldn't set up the camera, so she just had to kind of put it out of a window and kind of hold it. She also talks about the hours and the days it took her to set up these photographs. It's just an
I believe
amazing,
it.
amazing
I
thing.
believe
But
it. I
it's so
believe it.
funny. She talks about the church, the smallness of the church compared to the buildings, where normally you go to a town and the church is the biggest thing and the buildings
Right,
are small.
exactly. And all over Europe, the
Yeah.
church is on the high point, and that's
Yep.
the focus.
Yep.
Yeah,
Right,
so
right.
that's
You could see the steeple, and you knew where it
right,
was at.
exactly. And I think
Mhm.
this is, it's just so wonderful. It's in the DIA's collection because it's an extremely great example of what she's trying to communicate. We should go on to the
Dave,
next.
how many more of her pieces do we have? About, didn't you say 9 or so?
Yeah, about 9 more. Mhm.
Wow, that's so cool.
Fantastic. I wish
Oh.
we could have these displayed all the time.
All right,
Ooh.
this next piece is a
Paul, this
self-portrait.
is a real eye popper, and it's usually up.
Yeah,
Yep.
This piece is in the African American galleries, right behind the contemporary galleries. This is a self-portrait by the African American artist Buford Delaney. He painted it in 1962 while he was living in Paris. But as Ray said, just notice the intense, dominant yellow palette he uses. For Delaney, colors take on a very symbolic meaning. He chose the yellow, he says, to infuse the artwork with a sense of regeneration and redemption. This painting is 20 inches by 14. When you see it in person, it's very Van Gogh-like, and we'll talk about Van Gogh again in a minute. But the yellow is just in really big, thick, wet. It's just an amazing piece. But again, it's usually on view. Hopefully it'll get rehung soon, as the cars are now getting moved out. So hopefully we'll see it again soon. Delaney was born in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1901. There's a great picture. Didn't he captured himself beautifully, didn't he? Delaney was the 8th of 10 children, many of whom died in infancy. His mother never learned to read or write, but she taught her children to be not ashamed of their Black ancestry and to push them to become well-educated. Throughout his life, he maintained a close relationship, but a little rough patch every once in a while with his younger brother, Joseph, who also became an artist. As a teenager, Buford got a job painting signs at the Post Sign Company in Knoxville. His work was noticed by a prominent local artist, Lloyd Branson, who gave him art lessons and helped him move to Boston in 1926, really as part of that great migration as Blacks left the South. In 1929, he moved to New York City, right in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance heyday. He soon became recognized for his portraits of prominent Black artists, such as Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. And again, what is the Harlem Renaissance? It was the development of the Harlem neighborhood in New York City as a Black cultural mecca in the early 20th century, and the subsequent social and artistic explosion that resulted. Lasting roughly from the 1910s into the 1930s, this period is considered a golden age in African American culture, manifesting literature, music, stage performance, and art. Delaney, while he was making a living painting, it was the height of the Depression as well, and there was a lot of poverty. When times was lean, he fell back on doing more portrait commissions, but also worked as a maintenance man and a doorman in exchange for studio space. New York was more socially permissive than Delaney had ever encountered, and for that time he openly experienced in his sexuality. He'd spend his days in Harlem painting and his nights in Greenwich Village. However, when his younger brother Joseph came to New York, Joseph was shocked and upset by this seemingly radical change in his brother's lifestyle, and this caused a lot of tension and caused a terrific rift from them that eventually was healed. If we go to the next slide, though, you're going to see, so Buford Delaney is on the right. That's James Baldwin next to him in the left. In New York, Delaney also forged a very important friendship with James Baldwin, who was a teenager when they met. Baldwin looked at Delaney as his mentor, someone who was making a living in their art and not selling themselves for the art. I just love that photograph that Ray found. In 1938, Delaney gained national notoriety when Life magazine featured photographs of him painting in Washington Square. However, the success never translated into financial security. James Baldwin left New York in the early 50s because of some of the Jim Crow and moved to Paris. Delaney followed him to Paris, where he remained until his death. While in Paris, he experimented with purely abstract compositions and developed a form of abstract expressionism several years before artists such as Pollock and Rothko were claimed for doing that. This winter, I was out in California, and another docent and I went to a showing of Black collection of art and there was a painting by Buford Delaney in this abstract expressionism. It just blew me away. I was so used to this yellow portrait of himself. A few years ago, we had an exhibition called Detroit Collects, and in that exhibition was a stunning painting that he had done. It was a night scene in Greenwich Village, and there again you saw the sky looked like Van Gogh's Starry, Starry Night kind of thing. It was just it was beautiful. It's owned by a family here in Detroit, but I'd never seen part of his abstract expressionism before. After his death, Baldwin and Delaney's brother Joseph tried to protect and promote his work, but it wasn't really until the 1990s that there was a resurgence of interest in Delaney's work, and they're beautiful pieces that you can see. This is the only piece that the DIA has of his. Any questions, Christine, before we move on? Do we have time?
We have time for another piece.
There weren't any questions, but I just wanted to let you guys know. Gavin shared the links for the Claude Cahoon video and also for the Berenice Abbott video. So,
all right. So I won't be the only one going down that rabbit hole. Okay.
That's right.
That's right.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So our seventh image here is yet another photography piece created by the New Jersey-born artist George Platt Lynes. And, we can look at the image and we can ask ourselves, like, what's happening here? And what do you notice? Right? We see a man with his arms kind of around the legs of this nude figure, but the head's cropped off. And as we look up, we notice it's a woman. And we see a lobster vertically placed very strategically. So looking at the man, we start to notice his face and his mustache, which eventually will become a trademark of his, I suppose. And some people recognize that as being Salvador Dali. George Lynes' signature style of high-key lighting and dramatic shadows with the occasional odd props integrated into the portrait or fashion image, because he's known for that, tends to place him in the surrealist movement, but he really desired to avoid being categorized in such a way and have his work fall into categories. And we've already heard, unfortunately, this piece is not on view because it's photography and it needs to be rotated. The next slide. Thank you. In 1925, at age 18, he was sent to Paris to better prepare him for college. Over the next several years, he returned to Paris in the summer. And these trips changed him forever, as he would meet Gertrude Stein, and her circle of friends, right? So, we just really see the influence of Stieglitz and Stein here. And that really opened up a whole new world for him. He first became interested in photography, but not as a career, but as a way to photograph friends to display in the bookstore that he opened up upon his return from Paris. And he earned a very good living as a fashion photographer and received commissions from magazines like Harper's Bazaar, Town and Country, and Vogue. In the 1930s, he began taking nudes of friends, performers, models, including a young Yul Brynner, although these remained private, unknown, and unpublished for years. So I now have another piece that I want to add to my collection. So over the following 2 decades, Lyons continued to work in this area passionately, albeit privately. In 1935, he was asked to document the principal dancers of Balanchine's newly founded American Ballet Company. His series of shimmering studio recreations from Balanchine's Orpheus Ballet of the principal male dancers were stunning. They were stripped nude and photographed with theatrical lighting effects. And we see a unique prop here in this photograph here. And again, we're seeing his signature style. He really made these photographs, and he photographed these bodies moving in space with elegance and grace. And I wanted to say too here that, another person is using photography, right, as an art form. And it is now such a quick way to document the world around you. Prior to this, artists made sketches, but that took a while, right? Photography is pretty instantaneous. You can snap the photograph and start documenting, what's going on in your world immediately, rather than drawings and then preparatory drawings, and then taking them back to your studio and doing artwork, like in prior centuries.
And as you said, there weren't videos at that time. So
Yep.
when Balanchine suggested that he do this, it was really going to be the only way Balanchine could document his dances.
Exactly. So after moving to Hollywood, he became chief photographer for Vogue Studios, where he photographed greats like Katharine Hepburn, Rosalind Russell, Gloria Swanson, Orson Welles, Huxley, Stravinsky, and Thomas Mann. And then he moved back to New York because his interest in that commercial and fashion photography had pretty much waned. During his lifetime, he really amassed a substantial body of work involving nudes and what we classify as like homoerotic photography. The depth and commitment he had in photographing the male nude throughout his entire career was astounding. Well, why is that? Well, at this time, right, in the late 1930s, early 40s, there was no commercial impulse involved. He just did this simply out of his own passion for it. He couldn't exhibit his work, and he couldn't publish it. Now, these photos, which, like I said, were produced from the 30s until his death in 1955, at only the age of 48, are astonishingly ahead of their time, just like Claude Cahun. They celebrated not only the naked body, but also his sexuality in a period of harsh repression, and would influence future gay male photographers such as Robert Mapplethorpe, whom we're going to see next week. Unfortunately, by May of 1955, he was terminally ill with lung cancer. He closed the studio, and it was said that he destroyed most of his prints and negative archives. However, it is now known that he transferred many of those images to the Kinsey Institute, and they currently hold the largest single collection of his work. And we actually own about 6 other pieces of his work.
Wow. Wow.
Could you go to the next slide, please? Paul, we have about 3 or 4 minutes. Do you want to save this for next week, or do you want to do it right now?
Ray, I watched an entire movie for this particular one.
I think that's a go.
Yeah, maybe we can limit him to 4 minutes here.
I'll talk very fast.
Okay.
This piece is a post-World War II painting done by the English artist Francis Bacon in 1952. It's called Study for Crouching Nude. It's a large piece. It's about 6.5 feet by 4.5 feet. It normally hangs in the Contemporary Gallery. With any piece by Bacon, I would ask you to look at this and says, how does it make you feel? What do you see? A lot of the descriptions that come from Bacon's work include a feeling of being constrained, anxious, dread, foreboding, fear. A lot of times the objects don't necessarily look human. Sometimes they do. After World War II, Bacon established himself as England's foremost figurative painter, and therefore a chronicler of the human condition. He uses grossly distorted bodies, withering anguish to capture that existential crisis that Europe felt after World War II. Bacon was born in Ireland in 1910 and spent most of his childhood going back and forth between England and Ireland, leading to a constant feeling of displacement. He was mostly cared for by the family nanny. Her name is Jessie Lightfoot. We'll talk about her a lot, who remained close to him until her death. He was shy as a child and pretty effeminate, and his father wasn't comfortable with that. At age 16, Bacon was kicked out of the house when his father came home and saw Bacon standing in front of a large mirror draped in his mother's underwear. Fortunately, he moved to London. Nanny Lightfoot went with him, but he was able to live off an allowance from his mother's trust fund at that time. Just after he got kicked out of the house, he and Nanny Lightfoot traveled to Paris and Berlin, where he took up painting. He came back, though, to London in late 28, early 29, at the age of 19. He took up work as an interior designer. He also advertised himself in the Times of London as a gentleman companion, and Nanny Lightfoot vetted the responses. I think I know what that means, but I didn't go into any movies about that. But during the same time, Bacon continued to paint, but he never ever showed his paintings after receiving some negative criticism. But so to make ends meet, he and Nanny Lightfoot ran a very profitable gambling house in his apartment. In 1945, at the age of 35, Bacon exhibited his first piece, the one you're looking at right now, called Three Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion. He was an overnight sensation, again, capturing the post-World War II anxiety that people felt. In 1964, at the age of 53, Bacon met the much younger George Dyer, who was aged 30 at the time. And Dyer is a petty thief. He was actually breaking into Bacon's apartment. They met and had a long relationship. Prior to meeting Dyer, Bacon was always the pretty young thing. By this time, Dyer was the pretty young thing, and Bacon then took it upon himself to spoil this young man. They both had a drinking habit, and as Bacon's star continued to rise, his friends started criticizing his relationship with Dyer, and by 1970, really their relationship had ended, and Bacon just continued to give Dyer enough money to keep him in a perpetual state of drunkenness. And eventually he died of a drug overdose. It hugely impacted Bacon. And there's a painting that Bacon did after George Dyer died that is just stunning to see. In 1974, Bacon met John Edwards in London and began one of the most lasting relationships of his life. Bacon always suffered from chronic asthma. That didn't mean he didn't smoke. He smoked like a fiend. But he died on holiday in Spain in 1992, and he bequeathed his estate to John Edwards. The movie I made reference to, there's a movie called Love is the Devil. It was made in 1998. It stars Derek Jacobi as Bacon. You may know him. If you're my age, you'll know him from My Claudius. But if you watch The Crown, he played King Edward, who had to abdicate. But the young Dyer is played by a very young Daniel Craig. We now know as James Bond. So it was fascinating for me to watch it, but it's a very dark, probably very true, but a very dark, heavy movie to watch. There, I did it.
Paul, thanks so much. I thought it was an excellent presentation, Paul and Dave. I very much appreciate it. Next week, we are going to do, as Christine said, part 2. If you could go and advance the slide. And we'll hopefully get to Kelly next week. One more slide. Yes.
Two more. There we go.
There we go. So, next week is part 2 of these wonderful works by these interesting artists. Dave and Paul will be doing their presentations, and I hope you all will have time to stop in again and enjoy the works of such people as Andy Warhol, Jasper Johns, Kehinde Wiley, and Robert Rauschenberg, among others. We'd like to thank Christine Marks, our manager of volunteer development, Gary Lynch for producing today and filling in for Amanda, and of course, Kathleen McBroom. Dave and Paul, take care, everybody.
Right,
See you
thanks.
next week.
All right, see you next week. Come on back.